Our first panel of the day, titled Conflict Resolution and Mediation in an Age of Non-State Actors and Fragmented Power, will be moderated by Mr. Steve Clemons, Editor-at-Large of The National Interest and host of The Bottom Line at Al-Jazeera. He will be joined by His Excellency Ryan Crocker, Distinguished Chair in Diplomacy and Security at the RAND Corporation and former career Foreign Service officer who served as U.S. Ambassador to 6 countries. Ms. Fawzia Koofi, former Deputy Speaker of Parliament of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. His Excellency Pekka Haavisto, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Finland. And Dr. Khalid Abdulaziz Al-Khulaifi, Senior Expert at the Center for International Policy Research, State of Qatar.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Steve Clemons. I'm Editor-at-Large of National Interest, and I have a fun TV show that runs every week on Al Jazeera English called The Bottom Line, and hopefully we're going to get to the bottom line on the broad issue of conflict resolution and mediation today. I want to start this, and we've had an introduction of our team, but I just want to mention my friend Ambassador Ryan Crocker here. We ran out of countries for him to be ambassador to, essentially. He's been ambassador to many countries, of course, in the Middle East. But Ryan, in the notes that we began discussing this forum about, the world is different today. And I think I've been coming to Ali Soufan's Global Security Forum for many, many years, and we've always had a session on conflict resolution and mediation and how it should compete in a world that seems bent on conflict. But it just seems like we might be at a worse moment right now for the enterprise of conflict resolution and mediation, and I'd love to get your snapshot at that, and I want to involve all of our panelists in this discussion, because this seems to me to be a pretty crappy time for those people involved with conflict resolution and mediation. The hill has gotten much, much steeper.
Yes, it has, Steve.
Yeah, you need to push that button there.
There we go. Yes, it has, Steve. We are at a hinge of history, I think, globally, and in a revolutionary period at home. The second Trump administration is truly a revolutionary one. Its upending of long-established U.S. institutions is unprecedented, and it is still very much at the beginning stages. Now, a revolution in the United States means a revolution internationally. The post-war U.S. designed and led order that has persisted for 80 years is no longer what it was a year ago, even. The U.S. is clearly withdrawing from the global arena, both politically and financially, with great consequences for organizations like the United Nations and the International Committee for the Red Cross, where the U.S. has long been the predominant funder, and I think with huge implications for global stability.
So I know you're an American and you wear an American hat and you work for the State Department, but let me just push you. There are a lot of people in the world and even a lot of people in the audience that might have seen U.S. hegemony as not the best thing for them. Is there another side to the story that there are opportunities created by the strategic contraction of the United States? It may look more unstable, but might there be opportunities for other powers, regional powers, second-tier powers, to have their say in some things? And might that not be in eventually a healthier world?
It would be very pretty to think so, but I seriously doubt it. Look, I don't think there ever was a period of U.S. hegemony. There was a period of U.S. ascendancy, where we played a leadership role. We would have liked to perhaps have been a global autocrat, but we never were. It isn't that the U.S. is stepping aside in favor of some new order. China is not going to replace us on the global stage. No one will. No one can. And I fear that we're going to revert to a balance of power world. What's wrong with that? Nothing until it gets out of balance. We were talking a bit earlier about Europe, and Europe now trying to figure out its way forward without U.S. leadership. Well, the last century may be instructive in that regard. Europe led us into 2 world wars and the Holocaust.
Well, Pekka, you're the former Prime Minister of Finland, and I want to get your sense. The title of this session today is Conflict Resolution and Mediation in the age of non-state actors and fragmented power. But as I look at the world, there are a lot of state actors creating a lot of mischief, and not state actors, as we just heard here on stage with the president of the International Committee for the Red Cross. We see other non-state actors, non-state institutions trying to carry the water and to balance things out. So I'd like to hear from you as a former head of, basically helping to run a government in this world, what you think we should be focusing on in terms of the behavior and direction of certain state actors that are causing such havoc. We heard from the Prime Minister a moment ago, and I want to put it on this stage, the terrible humanitarian tragedies in Gaza. And we look at what's happening in Gaza, and I think it's all of our challenge in some way to address what would we be doing differently to change the vector of that course as opposed to sweeping it under the rug. And I should add that if you listen to the Prime Minister carefully, I'm going to be provocative here for a moment, and you talked about the humanitarian, if he were a graduate student under a student visa at an American university, and he had aligned himself with those people saying there was a major humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza in which humanitarian aid, water, and food had been weaponized, he could very well face deportation and the cancellation and suspension of his student visa. So I just want to throw, and that's by a state actor in this space. So,
well, thank you. That's a big question, and nice to be here. And also, when we are speaking about the state and non-state actors, I want to recognize the important role of Qatar as a state actor, actually.
Yes.
Making peace in Gaza and trying to release the hostages and so forth. So we state actors have not disappeared anywhere. But I think we are coming to the world where our multilateral system is not working. When we speak about the US, when we speak about the United Nations, we are facing now a problem. United Nations Security Council that should solve the big conflicts of the world cannot do it because of the non-unity, because of the veto rights and so forth. The General Assembly is giving the moral backing on issues but do not have the power to influence. And of course, the world is free for those actors who then want to find solutions to the crisis. When you refer to the Europe and role of the Europe, I have to say that on the crisis of Ukraine, for example, Europe has come better together than earlier, and not only the EU as such, but for example, Great Britain, UK is now joining, Norway is joining, even Canada. We look now as almost as a European country when we look at the world politics at this stage. And so there is also some kind of counter-reaction what's happening in the US. And of course, we regret if we are going to the direction where might is right in the world. And for smaller countries like Finland, this is a very dangerous development when we are forgetting multilateralism, when we are forgetting the international conventions and so forth. So we have to fight against that.
So if might makes right, what is the role, is the place for non-state actors to operate in the conflict mediation, the resolution arena, and the area of providing, humanitarian support and assistance for the ruptures in that might makes right world?
Well, maybe one remark. I have some background in working on Sudan as a European Union Special Envoy and also the Horn of Africa. And when people read the newspaper and read about the conflicts, they are asking why nobody is negotiating, why nobody is helping. And when you work on the ground and meet all the tens or hundreds of organizations who try to make the peace, you recognize that actually all these initiatives are flourishing, and sometimes it's very much the question of the coordination. How do we get these acts together? But we are in a world where these initiatives and the NGO's role and the private sector role can be very crucial in building the peace and having maybe the first contacts also to different actors in the war theater.
Let me ask you a question, Fawzia Koofi, the former deputy spokesman for the parliament in Afghanistan. I think you lived through a pretty torturous time, change not only in government, but a change in the entire orientation of regime. It's very hard for some of us that are on the outside of that conflict to know where state lines began and non-state lines took over. But in that, as you negotiated, and you're one of the first women to negotiate with the Taliban, let me just ask you, what did we get wrong that we can learn from?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Yes, we need to negotiate. It's time for diplomacy, more than ever, more than before, because diplomacy brings a balance to the power. Power imbalance is leading to misuse of power and to conflict. But there is a new approach to diplomacy. Other than the traditional channels of diplomacy, which was the state actors, there is now the important role of the non-state actors, which is, as His Excellency the Prime Minister mentioned, not only those who are using the vacuum, the chaotic vacuum, but also those who are trying to play an active role in terms of inclusivity and bringing a different approach to this, to the processes. In the case of Afghanistan as well, I think one thing that could be recognized is the role of the soft power of small states like Qatar, and how important role they played in terms of creating that process, making it work. But of course, the end result was not what we had hoped. And I think because the superpowers played it wrong. One thing that one could learn is, the state and the non-state actors from the one side to the party, in this case, the Republic in Afghanistan, and the civil society and the women organizations were not included, as one side to the party from day one in the negotiation. It was negotiation between the Taliban and the Americans. Women groups, civil society, the Republic. I mean, yes, the government had a lot of problems. I was a political opposition to that, corruption, all of that, but that should not give the reason for exclusion. So one lesson learned is that if things were set properly in first from the beginning in terms of inclusivity, as the new approach to mediation, which is inclusivity, which is the soft power of new dynamics in the global order, I think the result would have been different. For instance, when we were in the middle of negotiation in Doha, and was hoping that things will change in a way that there will be at least some sort of political settlement, because I believe if there was a political settlement, 60% in the interest of Taliban, 40% in the rest of the society in Afghanistan, would have been much better than what we see now. But all of a sudden, the President of the United States announced a withdrawal of the troop. I'm not saying that withdrawal shouldn't have happened. Nobody wants the foreign troops in their country forever. But it happened in the wrong way. So the role of the non-state actors, civil society, influencers, social media, political groups, these are crucially important. Look in the case of Gaza, for instance, the NGOs, the humanitarian actors, the influencers, the social media, the student associations. If it was not for them, probably we would have not been aware of what's going in Gaza to the extent that we are. In Afghanistan, the social media plays the important role of explaining what's happening to the women, what's happening to the people in the country. Although it's not an active war, but also there is a negative piece. We must make the process inclusive in order to avoid a negative piece, because not all pieces are positive.
Let me ask you, we're going to get into this, interactively in a moment, but one of the things that comes to mind is when you look at this region, you look at the broad Middle East, there are some trends, and I recognize that there's a representative of every faction that I'm talking about probably in the audience. But when you look at, I would say Israeli success in rolling back non-state actors that it was dealing with that were supported by Iran. So Hezbollah, I would argue Hamas, the pressure on, we're going to have a representative from the government of Syria up here shortly, a minister, the head of the White Hats. The map has changed dramatically, and in part it's because of a successful campaign against certain actors, and we may very well be on the edge of some deal between the US government and President Trump and Iran, which I think a lot of our friends in Saudi Arabia find surprising, but China helped them with Iran as well. I heard here in Doha recently, Anwar Gargash, the former Minister of State of UAE, open a window, open an opportunity to Iran. So when you look at that environment, which to me may hearken, some positive things, what do you see going on behind the scenes, Fawzia? Do you see that as a function of diplomacy, or do you see that as a function of might makes right power that has in fact changed the map? Israel changed the map in the region, and it's created new trends. So should we believe in the illusion that diplomacy mattered in this case, or is there a new power dynamic evolving?
I think we're in the age of a new power dynamic involved. The power of this, the smaller countries now in terms of changing the dynamics in the region. Also from a citizen's perspective, if you go to Europe, for instance, in Europe, a lot of people are looking actually to Gulf, to Middle East, to Asia, in terms of a future, not only their role in peace and mediation, but their role in terms of opportunities. So I think it's a new area of diplomacy involving not only traditional channels, but also non-traditional channels of backdoor, of engaging, actors that are not necessarily, using the chaotic environment, but civil society, media, as I said before, and individuals. So I think it's a new area, especially a new opportunity in the Gulf states and in the Middle East that one could hope and see.
Yeah. Khalid, I would love to get your sense as we sort of think about the dynamics of the region, about Qatar's role. Now, this is something I find fascinating, is that in many senses, while we may be on the eve of a new rapprochement between a lot of warring parties in the Middle East, I'm a born cynic, and I've learned not to believe too much in illusions. But if this going, what it seems to me is that in almost every major conflict I can think of, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Europe, all of a sudden Qatar is part of the picture. And you're surfing the waves of global instability by being a party very engaged in conflict resolution. So tell us what's going on.
So I believe, Steve, that in a fragmented conflict, the party that can speak to everyone holds the real power. And Qatar has made this very clear in its path of being a mediator. I mean, your question, to paraphrase it, why Qatar? If not Qatar, then who? And I think that's the essence of what's happening in a region that is paved by conflicts. Someone has to fill in the shoe of being peace builders and peacemakers. I think this is the normative of where all the essence of multilateralism and international organizations were established about. But today's conflict and the complexity of it requires you to adapt to the status quo, of understanding that the fragility of the conflict is no longer the traditional understanding of what a conflict is. There are many power sharers within the conflict, and you need to find the right path to tackle it, understand each perspective, although sometimes they could be controversial to certain people, but as long as they are power holders, they need to be in the conversation. So I think Qatar has portrayed that diplomatic niche of being a mediator, a peace builder within the region. And to build that status, I think, Steve, it's very important. Nowadays, we're hearing new concepts within the discipline of minilateralism, right? So I think it's a branch of multilateralism that has its certain interests sometimes. They could be peaceful, they could be non-peaceful. But to wear the hat of a mediator is not an easy job as well. It comes with certain outcomes that some states might not like to be in that position. But I think Qatar is quite affirmative to
So
hold
what
it.
responsibilities does that come with? And as you know, I've interviewed your brother, who's Minister of State for this and negotiator. He might be in the room, I don't know. But in this space, we've talked in the past about this being a strategic asset, a strategic capability of Qatar. That when something is a strategic muscle that you want to bring, you train for it, you think about it, you fund it. You've got to be the bank for it. You've got to create an academy for it. You're differentiating yourself in a crowded marketplace of other global do-gooders. How do you become the best at that element?
I think the merits of the best is just like the difference of the merits of peace. I think they're not far away. And the merits of success and failures are very broad. I've met with and it's a small team, the experts of mediation in the world, from US to Switzerland to our fellow Nordic countries, and it's quite the issue. But our understanding, I believe, as a researcher, a Qatari researcher on mediation is that I find the key characteristics behind Qatari mediation is as follows. First, you need to be quite neutral, and that's very difficult to a certain extent towards mediators or other countries that wouldn't be able to fit the shoe of a mediator. Second is access, and I think that's very important to be physically and diplomatically embedded within the key conflict zones. Third is legitimacy. You need to be trusted by the international community to play the role of the mediator. And fourth, I think to a certain extent it's applicable towards the case scenario, but quiet diplomacy needs to be in place. Discretion needs to be an important pillar, and I think Qatar applies it very well. I'm sure you interviewed many senior officials to try to get as much information as you would want for the bottom line, but there are certain bottom lines that you can't get to, Steve, I think, especially when it comes to mediation, due to the fact that discretion is definitely required when it comes to mediation.
So let me ask you all, ask Ryan to go further. If you think about the non-state players that also swim in these lanes, the ICRC that we just heard from on stage, you think about other major institutions like the UN. Right now we just had the annual spring meetings of the IMF and World Bank, and I should mention that Qatar and Saudi Arabia have joined forces to pay off Syria's debt to the World Bank just this past week, and so want to know that problem solving. You have the World Trade Organization. Now, right now, my country, the United States, is not very fond of any of those institutions, nor its activities, and may in fact be withdrawing. But as Kishore Mahbubani said on my show this week, Kishore Mahbubani, a former very distinguished writer, thinker, and former Singaporean diplomat, said, America seems to be pulling out of the order it helped create and leaving the rules-based order while the rest of the world wants to keep it. And I don't know if that's true or not, but it raises the question of, are any of these other big institutions, these non-state actors, are they powerful? Are they able to do their business if they don't have US backing? Are they dead too? What happens, Ryan?
Well, Steve, we're going to find out. And my optimism, let's say, is under control. Kishore is right. We did.
Your optimism is easily constrained? Yeah?
Very much so, yes. Yeah. My experience over the years leads me away from irrational exuberance and optimism. I think it is very much an open question whether the order that the United States created can persist and succeed in the absence of the United States, if for no other reason than the financial.
Fawzia, you were shaking your head.
No, it's a very interesting area. I think multilateralism diplomacy is important, and organizations in charge of multilateral diplomacy, like the UN, needs to be there, needs to be protected, strengthened. However, they need to also get the business right. In many occasions, in the case of conflicts, I think the UN has not really produced, a successful outcome, even respecting their own resolution 1325, for instance, in this case, or other resolutions. So I think the UN really needs a serious reform within. But that does not mean the UN as a body, as an organization, or other regional or international multilateral organizations should be weakened. They need serious reform. So I gave a specific context of Afghanistan example. When the peace process was going on in Doha, the UN needed to step up and play that traditional role of mediator, but they failed to do so, and so it was Qatar with an official role of mediator, because they were not even officially recognized by both parties, at least by the Republic side in Afghanistan, as a mediator, which was a mistake. I think they should have been appointed officially with the UN to requested officially to do the mediation. So now also, for instance, in the case of Afghanistan, I give another example. The Secretary General appointed a very senior diplomat to do an assessment of what next for Afghanistan, because obviously it's peace, but it's not a positive peace. there was an independent assessment and a political process was suggested. However, now the UN in Afghanistan, the UNAMA, requested suggested another process called the mosaic approach. So I think these institutions are in a very critical times because they need to prove themselves.
Do we need new institutions? Does Qatar need to come up with its own international non-state actor institutions that it funds?
The trend is towards that direction, whether we want it or not. The new reality of the global order is these smaller powers that are actually acting on behalf of the multilateral or replacing the multilateral. But that nonetheless, I think these multilateral organizations are important. They need to be strengthened, but they also need to get the business right.
Let me just put you on the spot for a minute. If you were to give counsel on what the world, what Qatar, what other non-state actors might do to really enhance the bottom line welfare of the citizens of Afghanistan, what should that be?
Well, whenever there is a meeting on Afghanistan led by UN, people in Afghanistan have less hope on the outcome. But whenever there is a
So they don't like the UN?
Well, not that they don't like it, but it's too much of politics in the Security Council. I was once invited to speak at the Security Council. It was an Afghanistan session, right? I was briefing the Security Council members. The discussion was on Afghanistan, but all of a sudden, the two superpowers started arguing on Ukraine and whether the US or the Russian withdrawal was beautiful from Afghanistan, which one looked more beautiful, which one looked more ugly in its format. So there is a lot of politics, I think, that is keeping the UN stuck to where it is.
Right.
It needs to move. And so whenever there is a meeting in Doha about Afghanistan, people are hoping. There is a lot of hope. But of course, the meetings in Doha needs to also involve other, as Dr. Al-Khulaifi said, involve other actors, the non-state actors, which are now the non-state actors.
Right.
Before 2021, they were the state actors, including the political opposition, the civil society, the women groups, because we need to make the end of a war is not peace. In Afghanistan, what we see is end of the war.
Right. Before I jump to Pekka, I want to ask Ryan. Ryan, you were the ambassador to Afghanistan. It was one of our largest embassies in the world. If the U.S. isn't there as active anymore, and I think probably DOGE is knocking out 95% of our presence everywhere, the United States, if the institutions that have been active non-state actors, the United States has helped fund a lot of those through USAID, that is now very clearly gone. Do you think we have a blind spot? Is there a side of this that now Europe, that Qatar, that other places in the Middle East will backstop the needs of the world through these non-state institutions?
Again, Steve, it'd be very pretty to think so, but again, I am very skeptical.
Even in Afghanistan, where it's...
Especially in Afghanistan. Look, that was a failure of U.S. leadership, and it began under President Trump. The Doha Agreement, which many see as the prelude to our catastrophic withdrawal under President Biden, was again negotiated under President Trump's direction. And we consulted with no one in that process. We certainly didn't consult with the government of Afghanistan. We did not consult with our NATO and European partners. We did not consult with our regional allies. We just decided we were tired of it. We didn't want to lead anymore. And we saw what we've seen in Afghanistan. And I think there is a connection between our decision to withdraw precipitously from Afghanistan and the Soviet decision 6 months later to invade Ukraine. Now, in that case...
Well, just for... It's still Russia, maybe Soviet again someday, but Russian-Ukraine invasion.
Oh, was that a...
You said Soviet, yeah.
Yes, well, the past persists, doesn't it? And now there we saw the Biden administration step up in a leadership role that rallied European, NATO, and an international alliance on behalf of Ukraine. We'll see where that goes as the United States steps away. And again, I would just point out that left to its own devices, the news is not always good from Europe. We had the Balkan War, which President Clinton rightly said when it began to unravel, that this is a European problem. Europe should solve it.
Pekka,
Europe couldn't solve it.
Pekka, so what we're hearing is a world that's going to be more ad hocism. It's going to be potentially, in my view, a more complicated, probably less stable, more conflict, more need for Qatar everywhere, in my view, and other deal makers out there. But as you kind of look at transnational assets, and I know we exchange a little bit about faith, about religion, about other tools that might be brought, some of the problem and conflict resolution that you've been involved with, even domestically inside Finland. I'm interested in innovation in this space. Are there things that aren't normally part of a big state and power discussion when it comes to innovation and thinking differently about how you get people out of their track to think differently and come to a different sort of resolution? Is there anything in your experience you might want to share?
Thanks, Steve. Maybe a couple of comments on the debate so far. First, about the role of the US. You are a superpower when you have allies and when you have friends. And of course, now we are a little bit challenged in situation when you are teasing your friends or pressuring your friends, how far it can go. And this is a new situation. This is like a laboratory of the relations, but of course the trust is a key issue. And when you see coalitions like China, Japan, South Korea coming together, you notice that something is happening in the global architecture where countries are looking a little bit to new friends, at least for the trade and so forth, and I think this is an important remark. Then I would like to come to Fawzia. You spoke about the Afghanistan peace process and other peace processes, and I think we have been excluding from many peace processes women, we have been excluding youth, and there, for example, the UN 1325, women, peace and security, or 2250, youth, peace and security, are very crucial, and having really the inclusive peace processes. I know that Qatar is also working for those goals. And what Khalid told about the success of Qatar, I think peace is a very competed area. We don't always notice, but there are many different proposals and actors, and definitely Qatar has been doing something right. But to your question, new innovatives, I was actually beginning of this year in Mauritania in African Peace Conference, where a lot of religious leaders from Muslim countries and Islamic leaders came together. And actually the idea in that conference was what is the answer of religion to people that are feeling threatened and are seeking for guidance and so forth, and how to have...
Just to clarify, these are different religions, or?
They were mostly Muslim leaders.
Okay.
And it was an interesting thing, because I was asking actually that why you are gathering here and why you are discussing particularly the role of religion. And the point was that in these days we have to be sure that the religion is giving a moderate answer to people in the middle of conflicts. And I think religional leaders have a role as part of the civil society and can have a role. And I was very impressed to meet people who are dealing with the Boko Haram negotiations or dealing with the Cabo Delgado issues in Mozambique, also based on some religional principles and so forth. So that's one issue. When looking at the Finnish experience, we have, for example, the Sami minority, the indigenous people, and we have been taking care of the indigenous people's rights. And in many conflicts in the world, actually, the issue of the indigenous people is there. We have language minority protection for 5% Swedish-speaking people. We have an autonomous island, Åland, a concept for autonomous region. For example, this issue of the autonomic areas we discussed a long time with Ukraine. Can we solve some of the issues based on these models that we have? So we actually could use in the peace process some existing models, and can also, we have a lot of visitors coming to Finland to look how these models work. And I have to say that when I was working in the Horn of Africa, people say that it's easy to come to Finland, you have always been living in peace. And I'm correcting people. We had a bloody civil war 1918, then big neighbor attacked us 1939. We have some experience also in Finland how to make peace and how to live in peaceful circumstances with your neighbor.
Thank you so much for that. Khalid, I want to talk to you about this sort of a similar thing about the cases that have mattered. Now, some of those, just to come to what Pekka was speaking about, dealing with Africa. I remember Qatar was involved with Chad. I think dealing with 50 different factions if I recall. You know, I often stay at the Sheraton Hotel, and I think some of those 50 different factions were eating breakfast at the Sheraton, and, you know, they enjoy the Sheraton breakfast. But you could sort of get a sense of the diversity of forces there. Or in the Ukraine crisis, of negotiating with Russia to get the return of a certain number of abducted children back. I'm interested in what your North Star is when it comes to dealing with this. And again, our topic is both, it's really, we've made it both state actors and non-state actors, but really dealing with the human element and begin identifying how you get that human element right in a world that seems very disdainful right now about people. When you look at Gaza, you look at what's happening at Ukraine, you look at other parts of the world, that human element seems to be something we've become you know, somewhat desensitized to. And I'm just interested in what's your North Star.
Absolutely, Steve. I mean, there is no doubt about it, and this just goes with the flow of the conversation as well. The reasons why the founding fathers of the United Nations has created the United Nations in 1945, the reasons why multilateralism, regional organizations were founded upon. And I think the essence is sometimes, yes, you need to think innovative, create new models and approaches, but also sometimes you need to take a step back, understand the historical roots of why certain organizations were founded. And I think that key is sometimes forgotten. And this is to take that back to case scenarios of where Qatar has implemented its mediation. No doubt the human element is of extreme importance, and sometimes it's forgotten within a conflict. I think the escalation of certain conflicts might result into really to forget about how important the human element is. To see it on daily basis on the media also affects you in terms of an analyst or a simple news watcher, to reflect upon the human element, and how does that reflect upon you? The massacres that we see on daily basis on Al-Jazeera that's happening in Gaza affects you on daily basis, but then you get used to it while you're just watching bloodshed in Gaza like it's a normal day in Gaza.
But isn't that something that's terrible?
Oh, absolutely.
That when you compare it to, say, 1968 and Vietnam, where Walter Cronkite was commenting on what was happening in Vietnam, it changed the direction of the American public with regard to that war. Isn't it a sad statement that we're watching in real time snipers and whatnot, people being killed in Gaza, and yet it is being watched at, and then we go play soccer? I mean,
right.
Is there some element of desensitization that television and visual images are not delivering what they used to, which is, you know, a correction? And is that something that worries you?
It's not that it's not delivering what it's used to, but it's more of how will the audience perceive it? How will policy makers perceive it? And I think that's the essence. The reason why we're thinking in an innovative way, we're trying to find solutions, how do we deal with non-state actors, all comes back to that. It comes back to how do we think, how do we approach it? And I think this is why I believe, as someone who's researching Qatar's mediation tactics as a small state, and to take that to the small state studies category, is that Qatar thinks Qatar deals with mediation and adaptability, credibility, and I think the essence of it is always finding a long-term solution. Mediation isn't a short-term solution. It's the idea of you have the responsibility as a peace builder to have a long-term solution to the conflict, and this includes sometimes being in conversation with a controversial group, whether we like it or not. Those are non-state actors.
So let me we'll ask you one more, and I'm going to ask all of us here a question. But the Prime Minister surprised me in his speech of really starting out with the discussion of the need to essentially remove room for terrorists. And I think he was talking about the kinds of terrorism in this region, also terrorism that we see in Africa, maybe elsewhere. I'm interested in how you reach and deal with that element of non-state actors and performance, how you turn that around. And as we go, through this in the minutes that we have left, I'd love to hear from you, in a world, as I think Ryan Crocker has helped us understand, of greater instability coming ahead. If we were to invest in one thing, given the realities of the trends we see, that might help stabilize, what would that be? But let me ask you about the terror question first.
Absolutely. I think the only way that you could counter terrorism is build a strong state. The issue is that the idea of a fragmented state has been spreading around. So in order to help and foster states such as what's going on in Syria at the moment, if you keep imposing sanctions on Syria, how could you help Syria to rebuild? If you're not there to assist Syria on the state rebuilding mechanism stage, then you're allowing the spread of radical ideologies around Syria. And I think that's of the essence. Building a strong fundamental state is the responsibility sometimes even of the international community to assist and help that state to build in order for it to counter such radical groups which results into terrorism.
Pekka?
Well, I very much follow what Khalid said, but today's terrorists might be transformed to something else tomorrow. We have seen this in Syria. We have, when you look to African developments in South Africa, ANC and so forth, labeled as a terrorist organization, of course, of its time. And I think we should keep this hope, but of course not to be too blue-eyed. There are definitely people who never can jump to the peaceful society, but I very much agree on the approach that in the conflict you should talk to those who have the power, who have the arms, who are influencing the situation, and you should bring those to the table, and that's the only way to go ahead. I remember actually in Sudan when my European Union colleagues sometimes advised that don't talk to these guys, don't talk to these groups, these are the bad guys, these are the good guys. And actually in the conflict, you have to talk to everyone. And if you limit yourself to talking only to the good guys, you are not solving the conflict.
Wonderful. Fawzia? Well, it should remind me the black hat, white hat problem that usually everyone has gray hats, right? So, but Fawzia?
Yes, that human element of and how humans are affected by conflict, and also equally affected if the peace process and mediation goes wrong, is very, very important. I think the policymakers and the powers have become so much insensitized towards the impact of...
Can you just give me an example?
I'm coming to that. And how much the world has become so, insensitized towards the impact of war on citizens that... and even the impact of negative peace, is that we just see them a number, and only numbers, as Dr. Al-Khulaifi mentioned, the number of people killed in Gaza, we just hear, 300 people killed today. It's just the numbers. Or 17 million women in Afghanistan are under house arrest in their homes. It's just numbers, 17 million. And we don't see the global problem as our problem anymore. We just are happy and convinced in our corners. As long as our borders are safe, we think the rest of the world, I don't care. So that multilateral organization exists, but multilateral culture and responsibility is no longer there. And that's why sustainability and long-term is very important, because for me, peace is, as somebody who has been involved in negotiating with one of the most difficult group, the Taliban, peace is not just signing an agreement and taking a picture. It should be sustainable, and sustainability is ensured when all the segments of society, including victims of war, the diversity of a society, ethnic inclusion, religious inclusion, as the minister was mentioning, women inclusion, will only lead to sustainable peace, a positive peace, because we need peace, but also we need positive peace, a peace which is sustainable and long-lasting.
Before I go to Ryan, I just want to ask you, because the power of what you just said was so hit me, but as I listened to you, the realism and also just the bleakness of that, you started out talking about the world needs more diplomacy, diplomacy, diplomacy. Do those fit together, the vision you started with and what you just shared?
We don't need diplomacy, but it has to be transparent diplomacy. It has to be inclusive diplomacy. Behind the scene diplomacy also needs to be, there should be some accountability mechanism on behind the scene diplomacy. Right. Because sometimes when there is behind the scene, people who are affected are worried the most, because what is going to be cooked behind them is something that is usually decided in this behind the scene. So behind the scene diplomacy is important, but it has to be with some accountability.
Thank you. Ryan, I'd love to get your thoughts on this, but as we I want to talk about two other superpowers out there. There may be more, maybe Brazil or something of the sort. But when I watch China today, China seems to be doing very well at this moment of America disaffection with the global system. But the other power that's rising right now, and I don't think being discussed enough, is India. It's extraordinary capabilities, economy, its demographics are so strong. And also when I look at Africa emerging, and I'm just wondering, is there another side to this story where there may be strengths and stakeholding in these problems that we may not be thinking about today? Again, I know you're going to say that may be pretty, but...
Your quest for a silver lining in this very dark sky is refreshing. I think you're right about newly ascendant powers, and India is certainly one of them. India now stands on the brink of a major confrontation with Pakistan, however. And I don't think that it is the exercise of Indian diplomacy that is going to prevent a wider conflict. It would be, guess who? The United States. And I'm not sure we're playing that role this time. So you can watch that space to see what the future might look like. Again, the United States is still a global power. And we're about to see it up close and personal right here in Doha with the first visit of President Trump in his second term to Qatar, as well as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And I think that is a significant step. And it puts, I think, a great responsibility on the government of Qatar, which has distinguished itself by punching well above its weight in global leadership. This is a time for Qatar to carefully consider the message it wants to give to this new administration at a time of revolution.
Well, look, I just want to say that I thought our goal today, which I believe we've achieved, is to sort of set the context for conflict resolution and mediation not being a kumbaya activity. It is a tough activity. It is hard to achieve in a world that's becoming more fragmented, more complicated. The costs of being engaged are rising, and the costs of not being engaged are becoming more consequential. So for that, I want to thank a fantastic panel. Please help thank Ryan Crocker, Ambassador Ryan Crocker, Fawzia Koofi from Afghanistan, Pekka Haavisto from Finland, and of course, Dr. Khalid Abdulaziz Al-Khulaifi. Thank you all so much.